Hello and welcome to this video, and today we're going to have a look at a really interesting exercise. Can you take the same driver, the same car, the same track and analyze the data from simulator versus in real life? And is it possible to use that simulator data as a practice environment to be able to transfer those skills to the track at a later date or to practice for an upcoming event? So what we're going to do is we're going to take some iRacing data and just recently, or I say recently, it's in the last 6 months, iRacing released the Formula Ford on iRacing, and we're going to take that versus my Formula Ford. We're going to look at it at Silverstone, and we're going to compare my driving between the two to be able to identify if we can actually find transferable skills, I should say, and then use those in a way of being able to practice and learn for upcoming events. And I have to say there's a big one coming up in November that I really want to find improvement from. So let's transition over to Race Studio 3 and have a look at what's going on here. Now, I have set up just a manual collection, which is data from Silverstone. You can see these have come from iRacing. These ones are actually in real life that we have here, and we can see just general information like the lap times. And the first thing you'll notice is they're not too dissimilar, slightly better in sim racing, and we can look at why that is and whether that's indicative of inaccuracies in terms of sim racing versus real life racing, or whether there is a difference in my driving. So we're going to have a look at some of that. So first thing I'm going to do is I am going to click on this session, and I'm going to click on this session here. I'm going to hold down the control key. Now, I do get a lot of questions from people saying, how do I open multiple sessions from different days, different years, maybe at the same track, maybe different cars? All you need to do is hold down the control key, highlight the sessions that you want, and then go up here to this particular button and click on it. And it will open those up for analysis. Now at this point, I might add that many of you may be thinking, well, hold on a second, how did you get your iRacing data into Race Studio 3 analysis to really start to look at it? Well, if you're really interested in how to do that, there is a tutorial set up. I did one earlier this year as a quick refresh. Plus, I've got a more detailed one about simulator analysis that you can use on the channel. I link to it somewhere, whether it's in the video or in the description or something like that. Now, that's the first thing, which I think is quite important. The second is I'm going to be using concepts through this, which I've covered in previous tutorials. So I'm going to talk about setting up profiles, and I'm going to talk about working through sort of setups of those profiles and analyzing the data, or maybe track maps that I've already worked through. If you're worried, or if you're interested in how to do that, don't worry, just look at the Race Studio 3 analysis tutorial series and you will see a tutorial for each of those particular areas. And I'll probably mark each of those with here's a tutorial that will help you with that if you're particularly interested in how to do that. Now, let's move forward with the analysis. So if we look here, we can notice that I've got a very simple sim versus IRL, or in real life setup here in terms of analysis. And the first thing we're going to have a look at is basically what's on the screen. I've set up a time distance, and we're just looking at speed to start off with. And interestingly, you can already say, well, pretty close. That doesn't look too dissimilar. I've also set up a time compare bar so we can see where time is being gained and lost, just like you would do if you were using this in a real life type of setting. The next thing we need to be able to do is to make sure there's consistency in the channels that exist between the device that you have in your car versus the device that, channels that you're getting from iRacing. Now, iRacing will send quite literally hundreds of channels, and we'll look at that in just a minute. And it's because there's no difference in terms of cost or setup when it's all digital to be able to have all of those channels. When you're setting up your race car, any additional channel oftentimes comes at a cost or an expense or a setup that some people opt to do differently. And so we want to be able to identify, how do I analyze data if I've only got a solo 2 versus how do I identify data if I've got a series of different channels like I have in my car, thanks to all the channels that get sort of provided to me by AIM. So let's look at that first and foremost, because we want to be able to make sure we're clear on what we can and can't do. Now, for anyone, doesn't matter if you've got a Solo 2, an Evo 4S, a latest wheel, or any of the configurations. And remember, we're looking at Formula Ford here, but this could work if your race car is also available in iRacing or any of the simulators and with the data you have in real life. I'm just using one that is related to me. So the first thing is we notice here that the Formula Ford is a Ray in iRacing. It doesn't matter if it's a Ray or a Van Diemen that we're comparing, because we oftentimes see these different chassis all competing for the win in Formula Ford. So there's nearest makes no difference any kind of issues with that's one brand or manufacturer over another. So here from iRacing, as I said, we have hundreds of channels to choose from, and the thing is, we won't have these in our car. So let's first look at the lowest common denominator, and I've done that already by being able to identify GPS speed. GPS speed is available in both iRacing and in real life in all instances, and so we can start analyzing that. And interestingly, so are key variables that I often use for anyone who's looking at being able to analyze their data from a Solo 2. So in this instance, for example, I can say, please add in GPS longitudinal acceleration. Now, the reason I've added that is that typically down means deceleration and up means acceleration. So a nice way of being able to analyze some data. Plus, we can also look at this in relation to other variables. So I've set up math channels, which really sort of work through here. And if you look through, there's a lot to choose. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on GPS. It's going to filter the ones to just GPS channels, and I'm going to click on one of these. Now this is GPS brake. This is a marker that says when the car is accelerating beyond coasting. And so in this instance, we can see how aggressive we want to measure that, if it's 0.3 G or whether it's 0.5 G. And that's just a force of how hard the acceleration is that will actually trigger this measure. So I'm going to do 0.3. because we believe anything over 0.3 G is the car being slowed with the brakes rather than necessarily anything else. And we can start seeing an additional channel that exists here that shows when the brakes are on. So all I need to do is go up here and click on Save Profile, and the first thing we're able to do then is that we can start analyzing this data. Now this exists for absolutely everyone who is bringing in iRacing data, comparing it to any of the devices that they have. And so in this instance, we can immediately see that there are great opportunities to be able to identify that if I looked, for example, at Copse Corner here, you can see that I am much braver in terms of going in on the brakes in the simulator than I am in real life. However, what's also interesting is that I lose time coming out of that corner because arguably without necessarily that fear factor, so to speak, where, you know, any kind of excessive speed in fast corners creates a little bit of nervousness in real life with somebody, for example, like me. In the simulator environment, it's sort of all gung-ho and go for it. And so it's interesting to be able to make sure that we're conscious of that as we're analyzing this data. But still, at the same time, we want to set a good lap time. So charging the corner is only as good as your ability to be able to carry that speed out of the corner. And you can see in real life or simulator, there's a difference. Now, it's interesting to have a look at that because we can study that and track in different areas and different trajectories. But we can also see in other instances, being later on the brakes has actually proved to be useful using this analysis. So you can see here that while I lost time here, and you can see the blue lap actually is at this point faster than the red lap, which is the reference. You can see that because it's below here. And if I click, you can see that the blue lap is 1.5 tenths faster than the red lap in this instance. By the time I get to maggots, you can see that I brake later in the simulator. And you can see that because here, the blue line appears first, the red line appears later, so you can see that as a brake. You can see it here, that the blue line is applied earlier and the red line is applied later. And you can see that as a result, I'm actually carrying better speed into the corner, and then I'm on the accelerator at the same time coming out of the corner. So everything I gain going in, I lose. And by the time I get down to Wellington Straight into Brooklands, you can see that I'm 0.3 of a second faster in the simulator. So through that complex of maggots, by being braver on the brakes, by being more aggressive on the brakes, and you may be wondering, well, how do we know he's more aggressive on the brakes? Well, let's just have a look at that. You can see that here because this is the GPS longitudinal acceleration. This will demonstrate that the deeper that line goes down, the harder it is on the brakes because the more amount of GPS force is being used to slow the car. So you can see I'm later on the brakes and more aggressive on the brakes without necessarily locking up. And as a result, I can actually then carry that speed into the corner and then carry it out again. Versus in the blue in real life, you can notice that I'm not as hard on the brakes, and then I'm arguably coasting through that corner a little bit before I get on the accelerator, rather than here on the simulator, it's brake, turn, go, rather than brake, wait, go. And so as a result, that whole transition, all of the time that I gained through Copse in this particular scenario was lost to the tune of about 0.4 of a second. So something to really potentially look at and work on when we get to the in real life type of scenario. Similarly, as we get through there, we can start looking at the same scenario that's happening in Brooklands as we get to the braking at the end of the Wellington Straight. Later on the brakes, more aggressive on the brakes, but in this instance, it actually gains time but then loses time. Because in this sort of situation, we may actually be working through a period of transition between that corner, and there may be a better scenario as to how to be able to work that particular corner. And in this instance, despite braking earlier, I'm rolling more speed through that particular corner, and then arguably, despite being sort of on the accelerator hard and accelerating rather than necessarily coasting through there, you can see that I actually overslowed. But where I gain time on the way in, I lose time on the way out. And so it's a bit of a wash at this point. I'm still 0.4 of a second down than I was overall, or in this instance, 0.3, because obviously I lost what I'd had here. Now, that doesn't really make a huge amount of difference until we get to the exit of Luffield going through Woodcote. And all of a sudden you can see here that the simulator line is actually doing a better job of getting on the accelerator sooner. And as a result, because on the accelerator sooner, you can see it here, that I'm gaining time all the way down Woodcote to the start finish, which means that by the time I get to the end of that particular corner, now there's a tail off here. It might have been in real life I had a toe or something like that, and we've got data now to be able to have a look at that if we need to. We can actually see that in this particular instance, I was nearly 0.6 faster in the simulator than I was in real life. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. None of what I've really shown here is indicative of the fact that in the simulator environment, you can be more aggressive. And you can really test the limits, which is true that you can. But what it's also showing is that there's not anything here that I couldn't really do in real life and be able to practice working through. Because the reality is, just like here at COPS, if I know, for example, that others have gone through COPS 5 miles an hour faster than I would do, then arguably in the simulator I can test that and I can test that, I can test that till I can find how to do that, rather than trying to do it in real life. But at the same time, if I try and carry too much speed in that corner by being too brave, because there's less of that, worry about smashing up your vehicle or, smashing up yourself, which obviously weighs on the mind of some of us, then arguably this instance I charged the corner and I lost time anyway, so it didn't matter being that brave or having that bravery taken away. So I found all of a sudden that this is quite a useful type of scenario to be in, but you can do more. Now this is where it gets even more exciting, because you can start doing more analysis. Let's just start having a look at some additional information here. So across the top, we've got some different options to be able to add in, and the next one I'm going to add is the track map. And this allows me to start looking at certain key variables on the screen in relation to where did I position the car. And as I started practicing more and more in the simulator, have I taken a different line, which might pay dividends as we get to the track and as we look at real life. And so we can see, for example, that I can scroll in and out here and look at different areas and different sections. And here, for example, you can see that I might have sort of taken a different line through COPS. And you can see because I charged the corner, I wasn't able to get down to apex, which prevented me, without going off track limits, to be able to get through that corner without, in iRacing, it being a disqualified lap. And in real life now, the strictness of our sport in iRacing, in real life racing, means that that lap would be disqualified anyway. And so we need to be able to think about this. And so now I can see the line using sim racing versus real life to see what's happening. Same thing applies in all of these particular corners. But remember, one of the biggest gains and losses that I had was in maggots. So let's scroll down and see what happened there. So you can see in this instance, I actually used a lot more of the curb on the way in, and I stayed wider here, which probably gave me an easier run out of here and allowed me to get on the accelerator sooner. So all of a sudden, it's a line issue, not necessarily a sim versus real life issue that we're looking through here. So that's quite interesting too. And so we have this option. Now I can look at different variables here, but I want to have a look at another aspect too. And that is one of my favorite things to be able to have a look at in this instance, is being able to look at the split times report. Now, anyone who's watched any of my videos knows that I generally tend to call the trio or the holy trinity of the 3 types of analysis you want, regardless of any kind of device, is being able to see the time distance, the track map, and being able to see the split times report that will give you the opportunity of understanding how to find the best time when you're on track. In this instance, you can see that if I look I can start seeing the consistency, and you can see the difference is that when we look here, you can see if we're looking at cops, which we are, you can see that there is a consistent charging of the corner. Look how busy these are here versus this one. I never got it right in the simulator, whereas I was actually slightly faster as we're coming through here, and we can see that in these particular scores. One of the things you'll also notice is that there's some slight disparities in the data, and that's usually when you have the opportunity to crash in iRacing and that's not there. So you may want to clean that up by being able to take out the laps which are probably going to be incorrect or inconsistent. And so we can do that here with many of these, whereas in the in real life scenario, with the exception of the outlap, there's unlikely to be anything that's really too different. Now we can start seeing where performance was gained and lost. I've got another one there that's slightly inaccurate, and it just changes all of these different variables that are here in terms of color coding. But at the same time, it gives you the idea in terms of saying, my best theoretical lap in real life is a 102.8. My best theoretical lap is a 101.8 in simulator. And so all of a sudden, I've got the opportunity to be able to take what I've been doing in the simulator, apply it in real life, and do better. And so I would say immediately that yes, there's a real opportunity to be able to do more here. And all I've done so far is actually looked at GPS-based data. But to finish off this conversation, we can actually see if there's more to be able to do here. And so one of the things I want to also be able to point out is you can actually bring in different channels. Now, if you're somebody from like me who has a throttle position sensor and a brakes pressure sensor, you can now start understanding driver inputs beyond GPS. Instead of inferring that that dip that has happened is associated with the brakes, we can see what the driver has actually done. So let's go back to the time distance report. We're going to shrink that down, and we're going to go in and we're going to turn off these two variables that are here. But one of the problems that you're going to have is that if I go into my Formula Ford channels, which are blue, and you can see that here, and I take out GPS and I type in throttle, not Throy. You can see if I add that, I can see my throttle trace, which is great. Well, it's not a great throttle trace, but you can see it on the screen, which is great to see. However, if I go here and I type in throttle and I add it in, it's going to show up as two different charts. Now, what we want to figure out is how can I see both of those overlapped and overlaid on each other to be able to use that for analysis. So we can do that. What we can do is we can actually go here and we can type in mixed. And so that's overlaid, that is mixed, and that is where we are now, which is called tiled or stacked. So if we click mixed, one of the things you'll notice is that they go on top of each other here, which is amazing. Now the reason that is that if I look at the channels here, you can see that if I go here, there's a number. So I just want that actually to be number 2, because I can put that in here. I can go into this one, I can say let's make that number 2 as well. And you can see they're overlapped. Now they're not perfect because they're slightly different, because one's from a simulator and one's from a car. But again, you can start seeing where the driver inputs are to be able to analyze that. One of the challenges I have is that my throttle position sensor doesn't go all the way to 100%. It goes to about 98% in calibration. And so as a result, there's a slight dip here. But you can also see that there's information there which is arguably useful as you look at this data. Now, we may want to add in a few more variables here. So if we take throttle out, we may also want to see what's happening with RPMs. So we can put in RPM, load that up. But what you've also noticed here is that RPM has just shown up on top of the throttle trace. No worries, we can change. Let's change throttle to number 3. Do that to number 3. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So we can see that overlaid on top of each other. And we can even do this with the brake as well. So if I go in here and I type in brake, I have brake pressure at the front, so I'm going to turn that on. Notice that's actually come up as number 4. If I go here and I type in brake, there's lots of options, but brake is also number 4. And so you can see 1, speed, 2, RPMs, 3, throttle, 4, brake. Same thing here. So now I can start analyzing where I'm applying the brake. So again, if you're somebody who's saying, well, hold on a second, can I sort of work the channels even though they're named something different? Of course you can. So the big revelation for me is that the simulator data versus the real life data is close enough to be able to start understanding what I'm doing differently in different areas and be able to say there's enough here to be able to move forward. Now there are nuances that exist. One of the key ones that we've noticed here is if we look at the RPMs. You may also notice, for example, that the blue, which is in real life, revs higher than the simulator. Now, does this have an impact in terms of anything? Is it to do with gearing, etc., etc.? So there are a few things to be able to have a look at there. Similarly, there are other aspects that we need to look at too, and I'm going to show you this in just a second, which is if you download sim data, it also takes into account your out of bounds laps. And so let's have a look at that and see what we mean. Now, one of the things that we did analyze earlier is that through COPS here, we're relatively comfortable, whether we look at it here in terms of performance, that the car stays within track limits at an acceptable threshold. And we know that, you know, this is slightly off, but not to the point where there's two wheels on and everything's okay. However, if I were to close the example here, which is the 102.6, you can see that everything changes. I'm going to go back to my channels here, and I'm actually going to open up the 102.3 because I'm like, wow, brilliant, I went faster. And as I open that up as well, you can see that all of a sudden 102.3, which is the red one, is actually now faster through that corner to the point where it's actually at this point 104, 105 miles an hour in, and at the slowest apex point 100 miles an hour. I'm like, that's absolutely fantastic. I'm really delighted. I've done a really good job right up until you look at the track map and you zoom in and you notice that if we think about track limits here, sorry for the zooming around for those of you looking, one of the things you'll notice is that it's because I kept my foot in it and I went off track. And I still went around that track, and all of a sudden you can see that I made the track much bigger than it was, didn't need to slow down so much, and so that lap wouldn't apply. So it's important to be able to have a look at what you're doing in relation to, yes, you can see improvement in the simulator, but the reality is going to be, is that really a good lap? So it's always mindful to be able to have a look at some of these things as you're analyzing the data. But arguably, if I close this down and I open up the lap sessions that I wanted to have a look at again, which I feel relatively confident about, and I open those up for analysis, I feel reasonably confident that I can now start practicing different aspects of driving in a simulator and then apply that to the real life racing, because it could be a case of line, it could be a case of application of brakes. And so if I practice that over and over again, and what's very interesting is that if you actually think back to a video I did, many of you may have watched it, some of you might not have done, but I was actually coached by a professional driving instructor through the service called Blaze. I will link to that here. But one of the things that's really interesting to look at is I can take the feedback from the coaching from Blaze, where I uploaded my in real life laps. I can give that information, they will send back analysis as to what to do, but instead of waiting until I get to the track, I can actually apply that knowledge and apply that rationale in the simulator, so I'm one step ahead when I actually get to the track going forward. So it's a very important component. So take what you will out of this, have a go at it. If you've got data, whether it's a solo 2 or in this instance you can go further with any of the driving inputs you may have from your car. If you like this video, let me know. If you want a little bit more information on what's going on here, I could make a further analysis video going forward. But it's a fantastic way of being able to start looking at, is it possible to work through your own data? Well, I believe yes, and it's something that I encourage you all to have a look at as well. Oh, and by the way, it leaves me to be able to say, as we all do in every one of these videos, just so that our videos get found, please like this if you enjoyed this video. Please give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you like to. Plus, if this has been useful or any of the others, help the channel a little bit by being able to add a thanks or a tip. Any of them would be great. None are expected, however, so if you like this video, thank you so much for watching.